So first we need to know what metamorphosis is. And this is the change or transformation from an immature form to an adult form, okay? So this is from like a baby to a grown-up. And this has to be in 2 or more stages. So when we look at our caterpillars and where they come from, they actually have 4 stages of metamorphosis. The first stage happened before we got ours, and that's the egg. So they will plant their eggs on milkweeds. So if you ever see a milkweed, you can go inspect it and see if you see any butterfly eggs on those. And then the second stage are the caterpillars. So this is what you guys have, and they're in their second stage right now. And they're gonna grow and eat, and they actually, sometimes they shed and they molt their skin on top so that they grow and have more room to grow into a butterfly. Okay, so that's our second stage, is the caterpillar. And the third stage we have is our chrysalises, and we saw some of those. Some of you guys have those forming. And this is where they get all nice and full and they start to go into that chrysalis, or some people call it a cocoon, or and I'm gonna not say this word right, but pupa, I think it's called. The fourth stage is when they've stayed in that cocoon for a long time and they've turned into their butterfly and they got their wings and they start to come out of that cocoon and they're able to fly, and they're the butterflies that you see around town or when you go in fields or stuff like that. So if you look at your caterpillars you have now, they should all start to be going into that third stage, which is the cocoon, right? So mine are starting to go towards the top, and they're all starting to get ready because they already ate all this stuff at the bottom is all their food that they're gonna eat to grow and become a butterfly.
All right, so we're going to talk a little bit about pollinators and pollinator gardens, because you guys just planted some flowers, and so those can be kind of like the beginning of a pollinator garden if you want to do that. But first we have to kind of understand what pollination itself is. And pollination is the way that flowers make seeds. So what happens in pollination, let me see, is there a way I can, oh here, just wait just a second, I'm gonna, all right, I think I'm trying to get a mouse going here. Okay, let's see if this will work. So what we want to do, what a flower wants to do to make a seed, it has to, the pollen has to get from here, has to go up here and down into here. And when it gets down into here, it can make a seed. But that pollen's got to go from there and get down into there.
Yep.
The problem is pollen doesn't have legs, it can't crawl, doesn't have wings, it can't fly. So it's got to have something else. It's got to have something else that helps it to get from there down into there. So sometimes rain will just wash that pollen around and it'll go down inside there. Sometimes the wind will blow the pollen around and it'll get down inside there. But usually it's a pollinator of some sort that will actually move that pollen around. And flowers are pretty smart because they know that the more pollen that goes from there down into there, the more seeds they can make. And so they really want to attract pollinators because the pollinators are what really move that pollen around. So let me see, why is my thing not moving? There we go. So plants get pollinated by different kinds of pollinators, and pollinators come in all kinds of different forms. Some pollinators are birds. Hummingbirds are a pollinator. They will come and drink nectar out of those flowers, move that pollen around and pollinate those flowers. Butterflies and moths will also come and pollinate those flowers as well. Bees and wasps will come and pollinate the flowers. And we're going to talk in a minute about how when they come to these flowers, they don't really come to pollinate the flowers kind of trick them into doing that. But they will come and they will pollinate believe it or not, there are some flowers that are pollinated by flies. These flowers tend to really kind of stink, and the flies like things that stink, and so they will come to the flower. That's what attracts them to the flower, and then they will pollinate the flower. And beetles, there are some different kinds of beetles. Sometimes like ladybugs or fireflies will come and they'll pollinate the flowers as well. And believe it or not, there are even bats that pollinate flowers. So around here, not so much. Around here, most of our bats just feed on insects, but in other countries, bats will drink nectar out of flowers and they'll pollinate the flowers also. So flowers, like I said, they actually know that the more pollinators they attract, the more they will get pollinated and the more seeds they will make. So they want to attract as many pollinators as they can. So what they do is they provide nectar for pollinators to drink. And so pollinators will come to those flowers to drink the nectar and they will pollinate the flower that way. And flowers then will announce to the pollinators that they have nectar by smelling really good and by having brightly colored flowers. So when we look out over these flowers, remember those cosmos, those zinnias, how brightly colored they were. Those bright colors are to attract the pollinators. They tell the pollinators, hey, I've got nectar. And the pollinators know those bright colors mean nectar, and so they will come to the flowers to drink that nectar. And the good smells, we like to think that the flowers smell good just for us because we like to smell them. But actually those smells are what attract pollinators. They announce to the pollinators that they have nectar. And so the pollinators look for those bright colors, they look for those good smells, they know there's nectar there, and then they will come to those flowers. Now I'm just going to go through this real quick because this is kind of, I want to say boring, but it shows how important pollinators are, but there's a lot of numbers and stuff. But basically, most of our flowering plants depend upon animal pollinators, about 85% of our flowering plants. So you look out over all the flowers you see, about 85%, at least more than 3/4 of all those flowers are pollinated by insect or some sort of animal pollinator. In the United States, we have 100 different kinds of crops that depend on animal pollinators. And bees alone will pollinate $10 billion of crops in the United States every year. So these pollinators are very, very important because they pollinate our crops. So without the pollinators, we wouldn't have a lot of the crops that we have. And so they are very important to our farm economy. In fact, native bees can actually increase our crop yields. They can increase soybean yields by 30%. So bees are extremely important to our soybeans. About 1/3 of all the food we eat depends upon pollinators. A lot of our ecosystems would just collapse if it weren't for these pollinators continually helping these plants make seeds. And there are actually some plants now that are endangered because some of our pollinators are endangered. And so the plants become endangered as well. So our pollinators are very important to a lot of our plants, including our crops. So what makes a good pollinator? Why are some insects good pollinators and other ones aren't? Well, they have to be able to move around a lot. Because if they can't move around, they can't go from flower to flower and pollinate a lot of different flowers. So they have to be able to move around. So most of them are actually flying insects. They have to have hair or scales or feathers that pollen can stick to. If they're too shiny, too slick, that pollen will just come right off of them and it won't stick to them. So they have to have something that the pollen can stick to. Some of them are actually adapted to feeding on specific flowers. Some of them actually have specialized mouths that help them to feed on certain flowers. And this sounds kind of weird. The pollinators that are very specific to certain flowers actually are the best pollinators. And it kind of makes sense if you think about it. If a bee or a butterfly goes and collects a bunch of pollen, and then it goes around to a bunch of different flowers, but doesn't go back to that same kind of flower, then those flowers aren't going to get pollinated. So an example would be like those zinnias. If a butterfly were to come and collect pollen from one of those zinnias, but then went and spread that pollen to other flowers that weren't zinnias, then the zinnias aren't going to get pollinated. So if they only go to other zinnias, those zinnias will get more pollinated. So the ones that are very specific, they actually do the best job of pollinating. Now, unfortunately, a lot of our pollinators are disappearing. They're losing their habitat. Some of the times their habitat is just, there might still be habitat, but it's so separated from each other that the pollinators can't go back and forth. There are some what we call invasive species that are not native that are eating the pollinators. There's diseases, parasites, we spray pesticides, and even our climate is changing and becoming warmer, and a lot of times that's endangering our pollinators too. So, what do pollinators need if they're going to survive? Well, they're gonna need food. So they're going to need like those flowers that you guys just planted. So they're gonna need food sources for their caterpillars. They're gonna need nectar and things like that. They're gonna need places to nest. In the case of bees, a lot of bees nest underground or in cavities. So they're gonna need places like that. And they're gonna need overwintering sites. And remember, butterflies overwinter in all 4 of those stages. So if there's sheltered areas where they can spend the winter, then that's gonna help them out as well. So we can all help them out by doing different things, planting a garden, planting those flowers that you just planted. That helps. Planting flowering trees, even though they're trees that they have flowers on them, that still counts, just like planting a regular flower would. We can put up bee nesting boxes right here. This is, you can buy these now at garden stores. You can put up these bee nesting boxes and the bees will actually go in and nest in there. Providing overwintering habitat, which simply means like maybe in the fall creating a big brush pile or a leaf pile that you can keep in your yard, like in the corner of your yard. And those brush piles and leaf piles are good places for caterpillars or butterflies to spend the winter. And then of course, maybe trying not to spray so many pesticides to kill the insects. That's another good thing to do. And anything we can do to help climate change, anything we can do to keep our climate from warming up anymore, because these warmer temperatures are not good for the pollinators. So just a few tips about pollinator gardens. What's really nice about pollinator gardens is if you can plant different flowers for different times of the year. Like for instance, up here, this is a columbine. They bloom in the spring. Milkweed bloom this time of year. These flowers here bloom later in the summer, and then these asters actually bloom in the fall. So that gives pollinators flowers all throughout the year. And if you can plant them in clumps instead of just single flowers, pollinators like the flowers that are in bunches or in clumps. And then of course, a lot of different varieties, colors and shapes, because every kind of pollinator, every kind of butterfly likes a different kind of flower. Some like purple flowers, some like red, some like orange, some like yellow, some like white. So a variety will give you a lot of different kinds of pollinators coming to your garden. And it's best to choose what we call native plants, the ones that grow here in Iowa. A lot of times if you go to a garden store, you might find some flowers that look really pretty, but they're from like Arkansas or Texas or something. They don't grow well here. So make sure that they're flowers that grow well here in Iowa. And then these are just some of the different flowers you can plant, different kinds of milkweeds. There's black-eyed Susans and sunflowers. The purple ones there at the bottom are called bee balm or wild bergamot. Those are good ones. Blazing stars, coneflowers, asters, those are all good flowers to plant. Goldenrods, clovers. So anyway, those give you some ideas of some of the different things you can plant to help out our pollinators. So you guys have a start with the flowers you just planted. And I think probably Lexi or Victoria is going to talk a little bit too about when those flowers actually start to grow, what you can do with them. You can actually plant them outside and kind of have the start of a pollinator garden. And then you can also plant any of these other things you want as well. So Lexi or Victoria, so yeah, we're going to talk a little bit about the monarch migration. And what's really cool is this is going to be starting up in about another, well, 2 months. We're going to start to see the monarchs migrating through. And so this is something to watch for. Monarchs are actually pretty unique in the insect world because they migrate way further than any other insect, because they can migrate up to 2,500 miles. So a lot of these monarchs will hatch out all the way up in Canada, and they'll end up going all the way down to Mexico to spend the winter. So they will fly a very long distance, and of course, most of the time they're drinking from flowers on the way down there. And the flowers, of course, have nectar. Nectar is basically sugar water, and sugar gives you energy. And so the nectar actually gives them the energy they need to make this trip. And they also are very smart in that they use the wind. So on days when the wind is coming out of the north, they get up and they fly and let the wind carry them. If the wind is coming from the south, they kind of hunker down and stay put and don't fly because it'd be so hard to try to fight that wind. So they just kind of, if the wind's out of the south, they take a break and they wait until the wind shifts around to the north and then they take off again. So they let the wind help them, and that saves them a lot of energy. Eventually, they all end up in the same place. There's 3 different sanctuaries that they go to down in central Mexico, and that's where they all end up. So all the monarch butterflies that we see, all the monarch butterflies that are east of the Rocky Mountains all go to this one same spot in central Mexico. And there they find perfect conditions for the winter. These mountains in central Mexico have forests. They have these evergreen forests. If you look in the middle of this picture, it looks like the trees are kind of an orange color. That orange color is those are actually butterflies up in the trees. They gather in such huge numbers that the trees actually turn orange because of the butterflies. And this kind of shows you how densely these butterflies pack into these forests. They cover the tree trunks, they cover the tree branches. The trees are literally orange with monarch butterflies. They are just down there in just huge, huge numbers, like hundreds of millions of monarch butterflies all in a little area. So it's really quite an amazing sight. Once they get down there, they basically just rest. They want to rest all winter long to conserve their energy, because they're going to have to begin to make the trip back up come spring. So they just kind of rest up and conserve their energy and try to stay warm. They will occasionally leave their trees to find some nectar or to find some water to help them get through the winter. So we kind of know how they get down there and how they get back. We can't figure out yet, though, is how they know where to go, because all these monarch butterflies make the same trip to the exact same spot. The problem is they've never been there before, because once they begin to head back north, they will get up to about Texas, and that's when finally they will mate and lay their eggs. They haven't done that yet. They haven't laid any eggs yet. Most butterflies, as soon as they come out of their chrysalis, they're ready to lay eggs. But these guys will not lay eggs for like 7 or 8 months. And so come springtime, when they start to head back north, that's when finally they will mate and lay their eggs. And then their young will fly a little bit further to the north. They will finally mate and lay their eggs, and their young will fly further to the north. So when we see the monarch butterflies coming back in the springtime, we're actually seeing like the grandkids or the great-grandkids of the ones that spent the winter in Mexico. So they come back, takes about 4 different steps to come back, but only 1 generation goes down there. And so we said before, most monarchs live several weeks. But this 1 generation of monarchs, the ones that hatch out of their chrysalises in August or September, those monarchs will actually live way longer than several weeks. They will live about 7 or 8 months until the next spring, when they begin the return trip back up. So this is the migrating generation. It's just the 1 generation every year. Now the journey is very, very dangerous. If you look at this picture right here, you'll see there's a praying mantis right there that's just eating that monarch butterfly. And monarch butterflies are actually poisonous. They taste terrible to most predators, but not to insect predators. So dragonflies and praying mantises will still eat those monarch butterflies. When they get down to Mexico, though, unfortunately, you can see a lot of the trees are being cut down in those forests. And so they're finding fewer and fewer places where they can spend the winter. Skip over that. There you can see, again, where the trees are orange. That's where the butterflies are, but you can see a lot of those trees have been cut down. So they're losing a lot of their habitat in Mexico. And then when they come back up here, they have to find milkweed. If there isn't enough milkweed, because that's the only plant they will lay their eggs on, that's their host plant. If there aren't enough milkweed plants, then of course they don't have places to lay their eggs, and so that hurts them as well. So scientists have been studying these monarchs for over 30 years, and they began to tag them so they could learn more about them. We're going to talk about the tagging here in just a second. And they've gotten a lot of other people involved with the tagging as well. You can get involved with the tagging. I'm going to show you how here in just a second. But we can all help out the monarchs, of course, by planting wildflowers, supporting conservation efforts in Mexico so they can preserve those forests for them. Because one of the problems with monarch butterflies is that they need both the milkweeds up here and the trees down there in Mexico. They're very unique in that they spend the winter in Mexico like that. If they don't have the trees, then they're not going to be able to survive their winters in Mexico. So they need both those trees and the milkweed up here. So